Is Travis Hunter a wide receiver or a corner? It sounds like the Jaguars are planning to move him primarily to corner next year and work a little wide receiver into the mix rather than the other way around, which is what we saw from him in his rookie season. Is that the right call based on what we saw in the small sample we saw from him on the field? Is it the right call when it comes to paying off the price it took to get him in the draft? Remember, the Jags gave up a lot to move up from 5 to 2 for him. We've got a lot to talk about here on the SumerSports Show, post-Super Bowl, pre-Combine. We've got my guy, Sam Bruchhaus, here with the data. I'm Lindsay Rhodes. Important part of this, Sam, and maybe this is a good part to start, need. James Gladstone has said that there was a greater need for the Jaguars next year at corner, and I think it's clear that that's a big part of the reason that we're here.
Right. I do think that functionally what this move is doing is adding a new player, cornerback Travis Hunter, to the defense. The reason why is because the offense really had quality starters across the board. You look at the pass catching room, you look at Brenton Strange, the tight end, quality guy. Parker Washington probably would have ended up being a blue chip guy by the end of the season had he been a major part of the offense in the beginning of the year. Then you look at Brian Thomas Jr., who we really thought was going to be a fantasy breakout player at the beginning of the year, ended up rounding, kind of U-curving back around, ending up being a quality starter, and then you add in Jacoby Myers. So there really was a halfway point with this team in which it became clear that if you add Travis Hunter to the mix, he potentially could be the 5th best pass-catching option on this team. And not for nothing, that's great. That's a fantastic passing offense. But we always talk about the second receiver problem, the third receiver problem. If you have your 5th receiver solved, especially if that player is a two-way guy, it may make sense to move him to the other side of the ball.
Yeah, and not for nothing, we're not looking for a 5th wide receiver with the number 2 pick in the draft,
Exactly.
right? So I think that there's some argument to be made there about whether he would remain the 5th receiver. Obviously, there was an injury that cut his season short, so we didn't get to see a full development. And I'm not convinced that he wouldn't actually be one of their top 3 wide receivers if he were to continue playing at that position consistently. But we'll get into what the data says about his rookie season in just a bit. The cornerback position is really fascinating here in Jacksonville heading into next season. They had Greg Newsome and Monteric Brown last season, starting at the outside cornerback spots, both of whom are unrestricted free agents. They have a couple of nickel corners that are returning, who I think were pretty good, and I think that they like very much, but they're really, really lacking in depth at the outside corner spot. So this is, I think, probably the predominant reason that we're even having this conversation is very need-based, which I would argue, and I'm getting ahead of myself as far as the or the value conversation, that's part of the reason that there's value attached to Travis Hunter. Not just that he could be a wide receiver that's high-end, or he could be a cornerback, or he could go both ways, but you could plug him in wherever your team desperately needs it. And both of those positions are obviously high value positions. So from a cornerback standpoint, what does their room look like aside from the things that I just mentioned, which is thin at the moment in terms of rostered players?
Like you said, they don't have a lot of control, and this is not a cornerback centered draft. After, obviously, you got Mansour Delane at the top, but they traded that 1st round pick to get Travis Hunter in the first place. So the Jaguars don't really have an option to get a premier cornerback, whether that's in free agency or whether that is in the draft as well. You got Monteric Brown, Greg Newsome. They traded for Greg Newsome midseason. You kind of operate as a result under the assumption that they are going to try to heavily bring him back. Monteric Brown, according to SumerScore, we thought that he was a quality starter. We thought that he was the best cornerback on the team last year. If you look at like the market values, now that we're starting to talk free agency time, both of these guys are like $9 million players. So there is a chance that you're not going to get a ton of surplus value out of either of these players, given that they're in kind of the middle section of the cornerback market value structure. And then you got your slot corners who potentially could move out to the outside corner position. But like Jordan Lewis was one of the better slot corners in the league, according to SumerScore last year. So it's kind of barren, except you have the number 2 pick, Travis Hunter, who a lot of people projected to be a corner just to begin with. They're in kind of the sheath ready to pull out.
He played a lot less at cornerback last year. We've got him at 162 snaps at that position. He played 323 snaps at wide receiver. So, frankly, it's a really small sample size that we have of data of him at the cornerback position. But the data that we do have, what does it say?
Yeah, and just to put that in context even more, he had 113 snaps in coverage and 225 snaps running a pass route. So we are looking at small sample sizes here. Over the course of the season, we kind of got a good view. The reality is what he showed last year is that he's just kind of a median above average starter. That checks out in SumerScore the same way that it checks out in the idea that he was kind of in the median in targets per coverage snap, the median of yards per coverage snap, the median in EPA per coverage snap. And then you move it to the wide receiver position, which you can find on SumerSports.com, and you have the median in wide receivers in yards per route run. He was 49th in target share. Wasn't really earning those targets at the beginning of the season in a way that, Parker Washington or Jacoby Myers was at the end of the season. If you want to get a view just in terms of the wide receiver position of someone who he was similar to in SumerScore, it was Darnell Mooney, which I think if you're evaluating him just as a wide receiver, you're evaluating him on the realities of the draft, that probably checks out to expectation. Like a quality wide receiver 2 is probably what he projects to be without injury in an offense that knows itself a little bit more with Liam Cohen. But when you have all these guys in the cupboard and you don't have anything at the cornerback position, you can kind of get the structure of why they made this decision. The question really is, Lindsay, is like, what does this mean for the initial process of the pick? And so I think when it really comes down to it, last year he shows that he was kind of a median player and he can definitely go out there and take snaps, but he's definitely going to have to make a jump at either of these positions to make that pick worth it.
Yeah, before we get into the value conversation and trying to debate whether or not the pick was good, I mean, you've called him a median player. You've said that that's what, you've said that the data suggests that he was a median player last year. I'm just not entirely convinced that we have a fully fleshed out picture of who he would be in the NFL, enough to say, this is where I'm going to slot him in terms of talent. This is how we could use him. We need to pivot off of our original plan. How much stock should we put in any of these rookie season numbers, especially considering the fact that it was a shortened rookie season at that?
I definitely agree. And I think with the wide receiver stuff, we can kind of get a sense. We talk about the sticky stats with wide receivers, target share, yards per route run. We probably got a fairly decent purview of how he would perform in an offense where Trevor Lawrence wasn't comfortable with Liam Cohen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that he's an extremely young player. He came out after his junior year. There's still a lot of projection to be had. So I would really, if I was in a front office, or more particularly the Jaguars front office, I would really struggle to say that I'm moving off of my draft eval outside of whatever I know from just seeing him in practice. From an outside perspective, it's going to be difficult to say that Travis Hunter still isn't at the talent level of the number 2 pick, whether that's at the quarterback position or the wide receiver position, which we talked about on our draft shows last year. We thought that he was was definitely the first or second best wide receiver and was definitely the best corner in the draft. So I find it difficult with a sample size of 100 to 150 of like true snaps in which he's doing something on the defensive side of the ball to get any evaluation. I feel a little bit more comfortable in the wide receiver evaluation, but I do think that, it's hard to be an NFL player, and he was just a rookie who got injured at the early part of the season.
We do with our SumerScore data. We measure every play of every player for every game and essentially offer up scores for each of those plays. And we went through all of his plays and found that we're, by the way, grading on a scale of 1 to 10, and found that 28% of his wide receiver plays were 7+. 7+ is above average starter, essentially, and then upwards from that. So essentially, he made noteworthy plays on 28% of his plays as a wide receiver. And that doesn't necessarily mean like catches. That could mean a number of different things, like an impressive block, or that he ran a great route and found a way to get open and created separation in an impressive way, but the ball didn't come to him. Like there's lots of different ways that you can have a play that scores really well, but 28% of his plays were that at wide receiver. Only 13% of his plays at cornerback were that. And I think that there's an interesting conversation because I think you just and I did just tweet out those numbers, and I said the average 7+ play rate for an NFL player, offense, defense, everybody is 28%. So he's pretty much going back to the median word again at wide receiver, but below average at cornerback. Do you know, because I don't know this answer, if that is actually below average at cornerback? Because I know we've talked about this a lot as we talked about the all-pro team and our SumerSports in general. Every time we talk about the cornerback position, we talk about how hard it is to evaluate. It's a position where I think what is a splash play is different kind of across the board. And I wonder if a 13% 7+ play rate at cornerback is as low as it sounds, or if that is, if we need more relative context for the position.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the necessity of being a cornerback, right? And I think that probably ties into why they're deciding to make this move as well, which is a cornerback doesn't really have control over his usage or his target rate. Obviously, if you're a worse player, you're probably going to get targeted more, we'd think. But we saw a bunch of guys this year who were targeted a lot, like Kamari Laster, and really played extremely well. And so it does bring about the question of you'd rather have him on the field for any given snap, particularly at, first or second down where you don't know if the team is going to throw. But you can control his usage on the offensive side of the ball. You are kind of dictating whether he's getting used in screens or whether there's a big first read that you want to try to take the top off the defense. You bring in Travis Hunter, you try to, sneak him in and all of a sudden it becomes a splash play, or vice versa. Whether he's running one of those, for the love of the game routes, trying to draw the safety because he's in the game and everyone's going to focus on him. So I do think that there's a necessity here to get a better evaluation about him as a cornerback as compared to a wide receiver. But moreover, you could potentially juice the efficiency just because you can control the play call, you can control his usage at the wide receiver position in a way that you couldn't necessarily control his output on a down-to-down basis, at least on the defensive side of the ball as a quarterback.
We did have some trait scores for him. I noticed that he scored his agility score at wide receiver was off the charts. It was a 10, which is the highest that it can be. He also scored high in balance, separation ability, and vertical threat. By the way, from a speed standpoint, he tied for the second fastest on-field speed on the Jaguars last season. We have his estimated 40 time based on his tracking data on-field speed as a 4.44. Only Parker Washington on the Jaguars was faster last year. So that's that athleticism that we're talking about here with regards to him. And that can be valuable at both of these positions, wide receiver or corner. Let's get to the value conversation here and whether or not the path that they took to get to Travis Hunter being on their roster, which was to trade up from 5 to 2, they had to give up this year's first round pick and also a 4th round pick in last year's draft. Plus, obviously, they flipped the 5 and the 2. So it was essentially they used 2 first round picks on him. And I think that there's a conversation that's worth having about whether or not you would typically use 2 first round picks to get a cornerback. Usually you would trade that kind of draft capital to get a quarterback, maybe an edge, maybe a wide receiver. I, again, like I said originally, could make the argument that you're actually just trading it for versatility and the fact that you can have one of either. Where do you come on the value proposition?
I think when you're analytically breaking this down, you have to evaluate 2 options. Number one, can he be a viable player on both sides of the ball at the same time? Are you functionally drafting 2 first-round players? We found that not to be true. The expectation of a player drafted with the 2nd pick in the draft at the wide receiver position and at the cornerback position are very similar. They're both around a $14 million player. We obviously have found that given he's not going to play a ton of wide receiver this year, he probably isn't up to snuff of that $14 million wide receiver player. Now, you put him only on the wide receiver side of the ball, that may be something, but we know we're not going to get $30 million from him playing on both sides of the ball. And that's basically what they needed to get, because you think about what the pick cost was. It was about $11 million. And if they would have picked Tedoroa McMillan, or they would have picked Will Johnson or someone else, you would have expected that $14 million. You add that to basically what they lost in value in that trade, which is about $12 to $13 million. And you need Travis Hunter to be a $30 million player. So what does that mean for value? Currently, the top paid defensive corner in the league is Ahmad Sauce Gardner, and he is getting paid $30 million, $30.1 million. The top paid wide receiver is getting paid $40 million. So the margins are getting really, really thin. If he's only going to play corner and not play a ton of wide receiver and not provide a ton of value there, he basically needs to be the best corner in the draft, the best corner in the league, in order to make this draft maneuver worth it, really.
Is it fair to put that all on him when you're thinking about roster building from a whole, like all of the parts standpoint? And I know the draft is about this one part, but if you're James Gladstone, at the end of the day, you just want to put a good roster on the field, right? And this kind of is relevant to the Lions' first round draft strategy several years ago when they took a running back and a linebacker in the first round and just nailed the picks. Like, those people are very, very good. And so the whole value conversation about whether you should take them in the first round goes out the window, because it was what they needed and it worked. In this particular case, I think the fact that they made other moves and they had Parker Washington kind of come out of nowhere at the end of the year, so they have value on him until they don't, until they have to pay him, if it even continues, if he continues to play the same way that we saw at the end of the season. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if he is good enough, even if he's not the best player in the draft, and they've used the resources that they have, and they ended up with the pieces that they needed, even if it wasn't necessarily him, then is it okay for him to just be good enough at corner and at wide receiver? Like, do we have to look through the lens of the money, like you're saying, if ultimately whatever he is works enough for the Jaguars roster to win games?
I think that's where it starts to break down to a certain degree, because what they functionally did was spend 2 first-round picks on 2 players. And one was Travis Hunter, the wide receiver that we saw last year that got injured. And supposedly now it's going to be Travis Hunter, the cornerback. And you go deeper into the first round, you start to lob, $2 and $3 million per year off of the expectation of that player. The draft pick that they functionally traded, when you aggregate everything, to the Browns is really more around $12 million. And so when you start thinking about it that way, Lindsay, and you start thinking about it distributionally of, okay, well, there's an average on the first year. They could have missed with Mason Graham. Mason Graham wasn't necessarily a Pro Bowler. He was a quality starter. He was a guy who played a lot of snaps for the Browns, but he wasn't an absolute superstar in the draft last year. And then you add in Travis Hunter, the cornerback, on year 2. Well, maybe that makes a little bit more sense. So there's so many interesting different ways of looking at this. But from a team building aspect, I think this is kind of a once in a lifetime scenario, really, where you have a player who functionally can play on 2 sides of the ball. It's just, if he's going to be a cornerback, and ironically, this aligns with kind of a fantasy perspective as well. If he's going to be a cornerback, there's a couple things that you just have to note. Number one, the market is not as high, whether that's the franchise tag, whether that's the transition tag, or whether that's the top of the market APY. So you're just not going to get the surplus value on his $11 or so million contract. The second thing is, year to year, cornerbacks are substantially harder to predict. So there is a real case where in any given year, if he has an 8 or 9 interception season, he could actually bring a ton more value as a quarterback than even he could as a wide receiver. The problem is, you just can't expect him to do that again in the way that you would expect him to do so if he was a really good wide receiver.
I remember when we were at the combine, we talked to Charles Davis, and Charles Davis said that he thought, I think, I don't want to misquote him. I think he said that he thought he was essentially paraphrasing, that he was a more special cornerback than he was a wide receiver, and that special cornerbacks, like high-end cornerbacks, are harder to find than high-end wide receivers. That's something that I also reached out to Mike Mayock for his thoughts on this, and he said the same thing, that it's hard to find a high-end cornerback. So as long as he pans out, then, you know, where he goes or whatever, as long as he turns out to be a high-end cornerback, then the value conversation about it just being a cornerback at 2 with the 2 firsts versus the wide receiver, that might be somewhat irrelevant because you're finding something that's really hard to find. And if it didn't pan out, then you could still plug him in at wide receiver and use him that way. I think I'm not surprised that we're going in this direction of using him at cornerback if they think that there is the potential that what Charles Davis said, that the analysis about the evaluation of the player, if that was on point, that he was maybe more of a unicorn, I guess, at the cornerback position than he is at wide receiver.
Exactly. And I think that's a great discussion leading into our draft talk. Is like, if you're drafting someone with the second pick, you're looking for an all-pro. You're looking for a defense player of the year type candidate. So you kind of have to adjust your expectations because sure, you could get an average player there. You could get someone who's even on the average for every corner picked with picks 1 through 10. But at the end of the day, you're really hunting for upside because you can't, there's one thing you can't get, and you can't get that upside in the 3rd round on the average, of course. You can really only get it in the top 15 picks. And Travis Hunter was a guy who people thought could be an all-pro corner and thought could be an all-pro wide receiver as well. And so if you're truly hunting that upside, you definitely are willing to take a little bit more of a risk. The problem is you're basically taking a fully additional player's worth of a risk. And so it's just going to be really, really hard for them to get that back. That being said, you're looking at wide receiver versus defensive corner. I mean, like, you can probably count on your hands how many great corners have been picked in the 1st round recently. You think of a guy like Stingley, who was drafted really high. You think of Pat Surtain, who was drafted really high. Sauce Gardner was drafted really high as well. Those were 3 hits. There's multiple other, Deonte Banks, Emmanuel Forbes, a lot of other 1st-round guys who didn't pan out. Whereas with wide receivers, like we saw Ladd McConkey in the 2nd round go really high. Like, you're able to get a good wide receiver in the 2nd or 3rd round in the way that it's a little harder to do in the 2nd or 3rd round.
Okay, so brass tacks. What is your evaluation of the way that the Jaguars have handled this so far at this moment? What are your thoughts?
I think if the process was, this is a once in a lifetime event where we're basically taking a guy who we believe in his character, we believe in his work ethic, and we can fail at one position and succeed at another position, I can see the reasoning in it. And I think I can really only say that because they were good this year, because it's a late round pick, because you're not able to access that point. And we were talking about Trevor Lawrence, who they did extend. We were not talking about Trevor Lawrence in the same way we were talking about him this year as a guy who led a top offense. So I personally would still not have done this. I would have kind of held pat, tried to trade back, or just go with Mason Graham and keep the draft pick the next year.
You wouldn't have done you wouldn't have moved up.
I would not have moved up to make this trade because I think the delta here, which is functionally about $15 million in value that you have to make up, $15 million is an all-pro running back. $15 million is a quality corner. Like, you could go in free agency and solve real problems with the draft. Or again, like, the expectation is in the draft, you could go and get that player in the draft and solve multiple issues. Instead, now you have a guy that has an injury. You're dealing with one player, and you're just not like spreading that distribution out enough. So while I think it was an innovative move for an innovative player, I do think that there's probably still negative value to the move altogether.
I think Because my brain doesn't compute math the same way that yours does, and all of the math that isn't actually like real money that we're attaching it to, it's like theoretical value.
Right.
I think that I have a harder time seeing it that way, and there's part of me that just thinks if he ends up being a quality starter for them for a long period of time, wherever it is, that there's value to rolling the dice to move up and get him if they think that there are multiple pathways for him to hit that, be it at wide receiver, be it at cornerback. They can move him around. And I do think that there's something to the fact that there's just the versatility built in. And we don't know how high end he's going to end up being at corner or at wide receiver, or if he's going to even be quality at either of those two positions. But if he is, then the fact that they took a player that they could say, okay, we made a trade to bring in Jacoby Myers, and boy, that worked. And it kind of unlocked things for our offense. And then Parker Washington kind of comes out of nowhere. And now we've got a wide receiver room that's sort of overflowing with talent. Now we don't have to keep him there. We don't have to make a move. We can say, where do we need a guy? And he is the unicorn in the NFL that you could go, all right, why don't you go play with them today? You know? And so I think that that alone has a little bit of value, just that it gives them that roster flexibility. I'm intrigued by that part of this, I think. And we'll find out. We'll find out, I guess. It will completely depend on whether or not he ends up being a quality starter at either of the positions moving forward. And if he continues to add value at wide receiver at all. Like if we move over to cornerback and then that kind of slowly becomes like, I'm a full-time cornerback and maybe a gadget player every once in a while, but not really getting a whole lot of reps at wide receiver. Like we don't even know what this is going to look like yet. We just know that the predominant position will be cornerback with a little bit of wide receiver mixed in. And I guess it remains to be seen how much wide receiver that is.
Yeah, I think to put it in more concrete variables, the way I see this needing to go for it to be a good decision that isn't a detriment to their team over the next 2 to 3 years is he needs to be at least one of the top 10 corners in the league. And he needs to provide some value on offense. Now, the sliding scale of that is
top 10 cornerback alone is not okay.
It's hard to do. I mean, like if you get a top 10 cornerback with just one pick, then you're lucky. If you get, they basically are saying that we need a top 10 cornerback with 2 picks, and he needs to provide value on offense. We just haven't necessarily seen a team be able to do that with 2 first-round picks consistently.
Yeah, we haven't seen anybody do that. So that feels like a lot to put on his shoulders. It's an interesting conversation, and we'll see how it shakes out when they head back to training camp. It's also kind of a weird conversation to be having in February, but here we are. The conversation came up recently, and we thought this is kind of up our alley in terms of draft value of picks and also obviously the ability to assess what he's done on the field so far. All right, that's going to do it for today's edition of the SumerSports Show. For Sam Bruchhaus, I'm Lindsay Rhodes. We'll see you again next week.